1 Thessalonians. We're going to probably begin introducing the book and dealing with introductory matters this week. I remember a long time ago hearing the statement that a book properly introduced was about 3/4 studied. So, generally, among brethren at least, we don't even want to introduce a book. If we do, it's about, well, here's the author and who the recipients are, and that's about it. And so we miss a great deal in introductions along that line. And I think from a personal standpoint, studying introductory material is probably harder than anything else as well. Or more difficult than anything else as far as the text.
You mean for a person to debate that's going to deliver the speech? That may for everybody.
Well, if it is for the person who's going to deliver the material, it probably is for most other people as well. The thing about the person who delivers it, they generally study about 3 to 4 or 5 times more than what anyone else does on it. So they have to weed out a lot of material. There's a whole lot of material that I just not even going to be mentioning. But we'll begin with the author of 1 Thessalonians. And who is the author? Okay. Ultimately, God. Who's the human author? Paul and Silvanus and Timotheus, or Silas and Timothy as we would call them. Look at verse 1. Paul and Silvanus and Timotheus unto the church of the Thessalonians, which is in God the Father and the Lord Jesus Christ, grace unto you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. Later on in the book, though, if you look at chapter 2 and in verse 18, you see Paul separating or distinguishing himself from the others when he says, wherefore we would come unto you, even I, Paul, once and again, but Satan hindered us. And so there's the beginning with the we would have come, but here I am, Satan hindered us. I would have come, though, once and again. So he makes a distinction with the plural we, and then at the end us, from the singular aspect him. Paul, we would say and do acknowledge that he is the human author, possibly dictating the letter either to Silas or Timothy or both. There's a word which you run across as you study these matters, and it's amanuensis. Do you want me to spell that one? Amanuensis. Amanuensis. We use the word a lot of times secretary. An amanuensis does what a secretary would in that regard, but does a great deal more. they would take dictation, verbal dictation, of course, and write it down for the one. They would copy, and sometimes even write on their behalf. And thus, as we see Paul and Silvanus and Timotheus, probably Silvanus and Timotheus both were serving as amanuenses. And I mentioned later in the book, Paul did speak of himself in the singular. Turn over to chapter 3, and we'll notice verse 5. When he says, "For this cause, when I could no longer forbear, I sent to know your faith, lest by some means the tempter had tempted you, and our labor be in vain." So there's the our labor, as the three of them were together at Thessalonica doing the work and establishing the church. But Paul specifies himself as being the writer here, as I could no longer forbear, I sent to know your faith. Look at chapter 5 and verse 27. He mentions, "I charge you by the Lord Jesus that this epistle be read unto all the holy brethren." And so it is Paul's charge. He doesn't say, "We charge you," from the standpoint of the three of them, but he specifies himself, showing more and more the aspect that he is that human author, and the other two simply because possibly they were there and in a close relationship with Paul as they established the church there and the work there. And so that close connection, and they are put with Paul in the initial aspect. But we often see that while Paul was the human author, that on other occasions he dictated the letter to others. And we won't take the time to read, for example, Romans 16:22, 1 Corinthians 16:21 through 24, and many other passages which show that relationship, Paul being the actual author with these others, and they being joined in with him. In reality, the authorship of Paul, as far as 1st and 2nd Thessalonians both, has pretty much been unquestioned until the 19th century. The school of Bauer, he was a Greek scholar, but also German rationalistic in his viewpoints. The school that he began and that continued after his death, they pretty much questioned all of the books of the Bible and their authorship. There's also the aspect of the Pauline gospel versus the Petrine gospel.
When was Bauer, the 18th century or 19th?
1800s. That's what 19th century would be. But in that controversy, those who held that taught that Paul, any letter that presented where Paul was not in a combative aspect could not have been written by Paul. Thus, the majority of the Pauline epistles that we have, as we recognize as him being the human author, most of them they rejected. I think they also mainly rejected most of the other books of the Bible as well. So it's that old story where a woman was listening in class, and every time that a book was challenged as to its authorship or its authenticity, she went home, cut it out of the Bible. And basically she had nothing left after a while. All of the books of the Bible have been questioned at one time or another. But Thessalonians, both of the letters, they really have surprisingly survived a great deal of that questioning. From an external standpoint, and I'll read off some of these names that give confirmation as Paul being the author. And if you think back in our Paul's class that we've just finished, hopefully you'll recognize some of these names at least. Ignatius, Polycarp, Marcion, the Syriac version, the Muratorian canon, the Old Latin version, Irenaeus, Tertullian, Clement of Alexander. All of them accepted the Pauline authorship of this book. And when you start looking at the internal evidence, that is the way in which someone writes, it is unquestionably Pauline in its nature. That's why really it has been challenged very frequently, or very infrequently, as to him being the author. It was written to the church of the Thessalonians. Again, chapter 1 and verse 1. The city itself, there's a whole lot that could be said about it and its history. I'm going to mention a little bit, but it's a very little bit. It was originally named Thermae, Thermae, or Thermae. I'm not sure, I can pronounce it, you can pronounce it, and there's probably a correct pronunciation that probably nobody today knows. That's kind of like when someone tries to pronounce Greek. Brother Norm Fields, he mentioned a couple of Greek words and said that I could probably pronounce them well. No, I'm rotten in pronunciation. I have trouble with pronouncing a and the and an in the English. But in reality, you probably remember two things, or it's one word pronounced two different ways, and people would argue back and forth, brethren have for years, ace or ice. Remember that? It's the word translated for in Acts 2:38. Is it ace or is it ice? Well, in reality, there are at least 5 different recognized pronunciations of the Greek. Take your choice. It don't matter. So, as I pronounce these names, take your choice if you want to pronounce them some other way. It don't matter. You've gotten the ace point. As I say, take your choice. It's right. But it's a name which the idea was bath or wells or spa. Before the Thermae, it was Emathia, and before that, Halia. Well, the first one, Emathia, Emathia, and then Halia, Halia. And as you read different authors on these, they even spell them differently. So the reason it was given that name, though, was there were numerous hot springs in that area. And many of them supposedly had medicinal properties. So come to here and go into the hot springs and you can be cured. There's a lot of those areas where there were hot springs available, yes. Too bad we don't have those type of hot springs that we can just jump in and we can be cured of our COVID. Or that's for you, Paul. I'm pretty sure he's listening. Or some of these other ailments that we have. I will say there are some good properties in hot springs as far as the body is concerned. It makes the body feel better, generally. But they held that these had special medicinal properties. In 315 BC, when King Cassander, he was king of Macedonia, developed and fortified the city. He renamed the city after his wife, Thessalonica. Now, his wife was the daughter of Philip II and the half-sister of Alexander the Great. So, being the half-sister of Alexander the Great, that's going to be, bring quite a bit of prestige by itself. Well, thus, if he's married to her, why not rename the city after her and receive that recognition as well? It was located on the Aegean Sea at the head of the Gulf of Salonika, which is the northwest corner of the Aegean Sea. I didn't have time to get the maps and everything, but maybe next week I'll have some maps that we can locate the area. But having said that, there's two roadways that not meet here but are in this area. The Ignatian Way, it was one of the leading highways that went east and west of the Roman Empire. So it linked the leading cities of Macedonia and the cities of here's another one, Dyrrhachium and Byzantium were on this Ignatian Way. almost directly across the Adriatic is Brindisi. It was the terminal city for the Appia Way, or Appia Way. Remember the Appian Way? It's spoken of quite a bit. This city, which was right across from Thessalonica, was the ending place of that Appian Way. So Thessalonica had direct connections to Rome by both of these major roadways.
Was the Appian Way in at the ocean front or some arbitrary place?
I believe it went all the way to Rome.
No, I mean
I
the
don't.
other end, the one near Thessalonica. Where's that in? At the Gulf or some arbitrary hillside or something?
It was the opposite side of the Adriatic Sea. So the opposite side is where it ended, in the city of Brindisi. So that's where it ended. Went to Rome. I don't know if it went past Rome or not. The Ignatian Way was east and west, and it did go through Thessalonica. So Thessalonica was an important city, having direct access to Rome by both of these roads.
How many people do I think live in Thessalonica? Like 60,000 for them to go. I wonder how much in Thessalonica.
Well, don't know as to then, but today, including the suburbs, it's a city of 1.5 million inhabitants. It's called Salonika today, and it has a large Jewish community there. Thessalonica was a Greek free city, like Philippi, and thus it was a great commercial center in Paul's day. It was the second city in Macedonia, both in size and commerce. The Romans divided Macedonia into a tetrarch, and Thessalonica was made the chief city of the second province, and thus Macedonia Secunda is what was referred to. Ultimately, though, it became the metropolis of the whole area. And it enjoyed the rights of a free city in Paul's day. It was governed by 7 politarchs. Politarchs were interesting because, and Philippi would be another of these, but with politarchs, they were actually elected by the people. The only problem is they were responsible to Rome and not the people. Well, that's because it was a free city, though. Being a free city, they had the right to elect their leaders. But it was always subject to Rome. Rome was the world empire at the time. So whatever Rome said, that's what went. So he was responsible to Rome, even though elected by the people. I would think, in my own limited thinking, that would place him in a very difficult situation as far as trying to satisfy both Rome and the people. Look at Acts 17 and in verses 6 through verse 8. It says, "And when they found them not, they drew Jason and certain brethren unto the rulers of the city, crying, These that have turned the world upside down are come hither also, whom Jason hath received, and these all do contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying, There is another king, one Jesus. And they troubled the people and the rulers of the city when they heard these things." The word rulers there is this word politarchs. Now, years ago, no, probably a couple of centuries ago by now, this was supposedly one of the mistakes in the Bible, because they had not discovered the idea of politarchs. And so when they saw this word politarchs, they said, see, there were no such things as that. And thus, that proves that the Bible was not from God. Well, sure enough, time and archaeology discovered the inscriptions and everything that was necessary. And sure enough, the Bible was right about it, that Thessalonica was ruled by these politarchs. And they would be responsible to Rome, but elected by the citizens. Thessalonica embraced a great many Jews as well as Greeks and Romans. So it was a mixture of people. As such, it had a great variety of ideas from a religious standpoint. We would also say that they had a great number of idols, and thus a lot of religious prejudice that would have been there. Let me just, as kind of a quick mention, Rome in relationship to religions. Because Rome was not, and the Roman government we're talking about now, was not exclusive in their aspect and in their thinking. What they would not allow is someone to be exclusive. Rome accepted all gods, all religions, unless you said that this is the only God, or this is the only way. Does that sound a little bit like what we find in our society today? That's the way Rome dealt with religions. Thus, when Christianity comes on the scene, initially they just consider Christianity an offshoot of Judaism. They didn't consider it separate from Judaism, but just a sect of Judaism, just like the Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and so forth. So they considered Christianity kind of like those. But Rome did not like Judaism because Judaism was monotheistic, one God. And all of these idols are false gods. Now then, the thing is, with the Jews, to a great extent, they didn't make waves too much as far as trying to evangelize anyone. They stayed to themselves. They were separate from all these nations. And so they didn't bother anyone, so Rome didn't bother them too much. What did Christianity do, though? Christianity went out preaching to everyone, and that brings the ire of the Roman government as well, because you cannot say there's only one way. You cannot hold that there's only one God. You have to accept everyone. And as long as you accept everyone, we'll be fine.
They said Jesus was coming at the end of time. He was coming in the clouds, not the gods. And that made waves right there.
Well, the aspect of acceptance of others and not the rejection of their religious systems or the rejection of their gods is what caused the problems. So that's a little bit as to the background of the city. It would have been filled with various religious thinking, various idols, and thus, of course, Christianity being opposed to that. As far as the church at Thessalonica, Paul began his work in the city at the Jewish synagogue. Again, let's go back to Acts the 17th chapter. And while this is a little bit lengthy, I'm going to read, basically this is the beginning of the church there and Paul's work. So in Acts 17, starting in verse 1, and when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where was a synagogue of the Jews. And Paul, as his manner was, went in unto them, and 3 Sabbath days reasoned with them out of the Scriptures, opening and alleging that Christ must needs have suffered, and risen again from the dead, and that Jesus, whom I preach unto you, is Christ. And some of them believed, and consorted with Paul and Silas, and of the devout Greeks a great multitude, and of the chief women not a few. But the Jews which believed not, moved with envy, took unto them certain lewd fellows of the baser sort, and gathered a company, and set all the city in an uproar, and assaulted the house of Jason, and bring them out. I get that. And sought to bring them out to the people. And when they found them not, they drew Jason and certain brethren unto the rulers of the city, crying, These that have turned the world upside down are come hither also, whom Jason has received. And those all do contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, one Jesus. And they troubled the people and the rulers of the city when they heard these things. And when they had taken security of Jason and of the other, they let them go. And the brethren immediately sent away Paul and Silas by night unto Berea, whose coming thither went into the synagogue of the Jews. These were more noble than those in Thessalonica, in that they received the word with all readiness of mind, and searched the Scriptures daily, whether those things were so. Where therefore many of them which believed, also of honorable women which were Greeks, and of men not a few. But when the Jews of Thessalonica had knowledge that the word of God was preached to Paul at Berea, they came thither also, and stirred up the people. And then immediately the brethren sent away Paul to go as it were by the sea, but Silas and Timotheus abode there still. And they that conducted Paul brought him unto Athens, and receiving a commandment unto Silas and Timotheus for to come to him with all speed, they departed. Now when Paul waited for them at Athens, his spirit was stirred in him when he saw the city wholly given to idolatry. And I'm going to skip down to, because this is Paul's sermon on Mars Hill now. And skip down to verse 32, and we'll pick back up there. And when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, and others said, "We will hear thee again of this matter." So Paul departed from among them. Howbeit certain men clave unto him and believed, which among the which was Dionysus the Areopagite, and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. After these things, Paul departed from Athens and came to Corinth. Now remember that part. Now he's at Corinth. And found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, lately come from Italy, with his wife Priscilla, because that Claudius had commanded all Jews to depart from Rome, and came unto them. And because he was of the same craft, he abode with them and wrought, for by their occupation they were tent makers. And he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath, and persuaded Jews and Greeks. And when Silas and Timotheus, now where were they? They had been left back in Thessalonica and Berea. When Silas and Timotheus were come from Macedonia, which would be that area of Thessalonica, Paul was pressed in the Spirit and testified to the Jews that Jesus was Christ. And when they opposed themselves and blasphemed, he shook his raiment and said unto them, "Your blood be upon your own heads. I am clean. From henceforth I will go unto the Gentiles." So here's Paul at Thessalonica. This is on his second missionary journey. With him were both Silas and Timothy. He begins preaching in the synagogue for 3 Sabbath days. I saw one in studying this, it said 3 days. Now, wait, that doesn't sound right. Something's wrong. Well, it was 3 Sabbath days. Well, in one sense, that's 3 days, isn't it? Well, how many of us believe that Paul remained quiet and didn't do any preaching and teaching in between those Sabbath days? Very unlikely, knowing Paul. So it lasted for 3 Sabbath days, though. And there were some who responded favorably to the message that Paul was preaching. But then opposition comes, and they take up Jason and take him to the politarchs. And because they could not find Paul, I'm sure that they were seeking Paul, but they just found Jason. Politarchs would be the rulers of the city, basically. They were those who were elected by the cities, but responsible to the Rome. So they ended up being Roman rulers elected by the city. But with it,
you know, brother, after there's no way to prove a negative, don't you? So them and I and Polycarp made no difference. You right?
I think I improved some negatives.
Prove a negative?
Yeah.
What would that be?
It's all in the way you word it. It comes out to be a positive, but it's also a negative. Mechanical instruments of music are not authorized in the New Testament. That's a negative.
It is.
Can I prove that?
Even that's got exception
generally in a debate, you do not want to take a negative position. You want a positive proposition. That's why when Anthony Flew debated Tom Warren, Flew begins the debate basically by going to this very thing which you mentioned. You can't prove a negative. Well, and yet people had criticized him in taking a negative argument or a negative proposition. I know that God does not exist because of that very thing. The easy answer to that, which disproves it, do you know everything? No. Well, the one thing you might not know then is that God exists. So, but from a general standpoint, you do not want to, in a debate, take a negative proposition. You want to, in my debate with Bob Ross, I took basically a negative proposition that instrumental music was sinful. Because that gets to the heart of the question, really. But the opposition that they faced caused Paul to leave Thessalonica, goes to Berea. It does seem, though, if you look at 1 Thessalonians 2 and verse 9, where it states that, "For ye remember, brethren, our labor and travail for laboring night and day, because we would not be chargeable unto any of you. We preach unto you the gospel of God." It seems as if Paul supported himself in the preaching of the gospel at Thessalonica. We'll stop there, and since Andrew's about to ring the bell, and start with some more ideas and thoughts next week, Lord willing.